The beacon had been running for 11 years before anyone answered it. Suyan checked the power cell on the transmitter the same way she checked everything on Jungto Station, out of habit, not hope. The cell read 34%. She swapped it for a fresh one, tucked the old one into her vest pocket for recycling, and climbed back down the ladder from the signal tower. The red dust of Kepler 442's third moon coated her boots. It always did. No matter how many times she sealed the airlock, the dust found a way in. It smelled faintly of copper and something older, like the inside of a tin cup left in the rain. "Anything?" called Minjin from the equipment bay. "Same as yesterday," she said. He grunted. That was Minjin's entire vocabulary some mornings. Grunt for yes, grunt for no, grunt for I told you so, though he never actually said that last one out loud. He had the decency not to. Jungto Station had started as a refueling relay post, built by the third colonial wave out of Busan Orbital. 43 people, one geothermal tap, two greenhouse domes, a workshop full of salvaged parts, and a signal tower that had been transmitting on 18 different frequencies since before Suyan was born. Her mother had programmed the beacon. Her grandmother had helped build the tower. By the time Suyan took over station management at 31, the colony had grown to 112 souls, a small river diversion, and a reputation, among themselves at least, for being the most stubborn outpost in the uncatalogued deep. They had not heard from Earth in 9 years. The relay network had failed somewhere along the chain, the way relay networks did out here. They weren't panicking about it. They'd been self-sufficient for decades, but the beacon kept running, and Suyan kept changing the power cells because her mother had told her to keep the light on. So when the sensors registered an unidentified craft at 0340 station time on a Thursday, Suyan's first reaction was not relief or fear. It was mild irritation that she was being woken up. She pulled on her thermal layer in the dark, knocked her shin on the bed frame, the same corner she'd knocked it on 100 times before, and made her way to the monitoring room. Minjun was already there, which meant he'd never gone to sleep, which was his own problem. "Contact?" she asked. "Confirmed. Drive signature doesn't match anything in the catalog, but it's slowing down." He pointed at the trajectory arc on his screen. "It's coming toward us deliberately, not a debris drift." Suyan stood behind him and looked at the numbers. The craft was decelerating at a rate that suggested considerable engine power. It would reach orbital distance in about 6 hours. She pulled up the external camera feed and saw nothing yet. Just the dark, and the faint sprinkle of stars she'd memorized so thoroughly she'd stopped seeing them as beautiful years ago. "Wake the council," she said, "and make coffee, a lot of it." The council was 5 people. Suyan, Minjun, Dr. Hana Beck who ran the medical bay, old Mr. Chul who had been born on Jungto and remembered things nobody else did, and a young engineer named Jisoo who had opinions about everything and the math to back most of them up. They gathered in the common room by 0400. Jisoo had brought a notepad and was already sketching possible ship configurations based on the drive signature. Chul had brought dried plum candy and was eating it without offering any to anyone. "Options," Suyan said. "It could be another human colony ship," Hana offered. "Long range, rerouted." "Drive signature's wrong," Jisoo said, without looking up. "Earth military?" Minjun suggested. "Still wrong," Chul said through a mouthful of candy. "My grandfather's logs mentioned a survey from the 2019s. Said there were things out in this sector that weren't catalogued. Not debris, not human." He shrugged when everyone looked at him. He was also fond of drink. I never knew what to believe. Suyan said, "We keep the beacon transmitting. We add a greeting sequence, standard universal mathematics, the package Dr. Park designed before she passed. We don't power up weapons because we don't have weapons worth mentioning. We open the good channel and we wait." She looked around the table. Questions? Nobody had questions. That was the thing about Jungto. They'd been making do without outside answers for so long that they'd stopped expecting someone else to solve their problems. It made meetings efficient. The ship arrived at 1100 station time, settling into a holding orbit about 800 kilometers above the moon's surface. It was enormous. Suyan stood at the observation port with everyone who could fit in the room behind her and looked at the thing through the magnification feed. It was roughly elliptical, a flattened ovoid, its hull a deep gray-green with surface texturing that looked almost organic, ridges and channels running in parallel lines from bow to stern. No visible weapon ports, which either meant it was peaceful or that it hid its weapons better than they did. Then the hailing signal came through. Not radio. It came through the deep space acoustic medium, a method Jungto's equipment could barely receive. It came as a pattern, prime numbers first, then something more complex, mathematical progressions that Jisoo identified in about 4 minutes flat, with her eyes wide and her candy untouched. They read our beacon, Jisoo breathed. They're answering it. They're following our format. Soo-yeon said, "How long to establish basic linguistic framework?" Jisoo looked at her pad, then at the ceiling, then at her pad again. If they're fast, 40 hours. If we're both fast, maybe 20. It took 16. The beings called themselves the Vetheron. Their language, when it finally resolved into something translatable, had 2 acoustic registers, one in the range of human hearing, one below it, and their translator unit worked by constructing concepts in parallel rather than linear syntax. This meant that when they spoke, they said the emotional context of a sentence at the same time as its literal content, layered one on top of the other like harmonics in a chord. Hana said it was beautiful. Minjun said it gave him a headache. Their designated communicator, the one who had been operating their translation system, was named something that rendered in the linguistic framework as a long, resonant phrase meaning approximately the one who walks the frequency between silence and speech. That was too long, and Jungto's people being practical, Jisoo started calling him Freak. He didn't seem to mind, or rather, his response to the nickname carried a harmonic that Hana identified as something close to amused. The Vetheron sent a landing party down on their second day in orbit. 3 individuals, in a small atmospheric shuttle that landed with surprising delicacy on the flat ground outside Jungto's main dome. Soo-yeon went out to meet them in an environment suit, not because she doubted their intentions, but because it was protocol, and also because if something did go wrong, she wanted the suit between her skin and whatever went wrong. Freak was taller than she'd expected from the size ratio in the ship feeds. He stood nearly 2 meters, lean in the way that suggested a lower gravity homeworld, his form covered in close-fitted materials that shifted color faintly at the joints when he moved. His face, or the nearest analog, was angular, with a wide flat nose and eyes placed more laterally than a human's, large and dark amber, with a third eyelid that moved horizontally across them when he blinked. His skin was the same gray-green as his ship. He had no hair, but a series of small raised ridges ran back from his forehead along the crown of his skull, and these moved, subtly, expressively, the way eyebrows moved on a human face. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, through the suit communicator and through the translation unit he carried, "Welcome to Jungto Station. I'm Soo-yeon. I manage this colony." The translation unit processed. His 2 companions were flanking him, alert, reading their environment the way trained people read environments. But Freak himself, his ridges moved in a slow ripple. "You expected a rival," the unit rendered, with a harmonic underneath it that Hana later identified as something between respect and curiosity. "Your signal was not distress, it was greeting." "My grandmother built that beacon to say hello," Soo-yeon said. "It took a while for anyone to say hello back." The ridges moved again. Hana would later call that ripple his equivalent of a slow, genuine smile. The first 3 days were professional and careful and only occasionally disastrous. There was the incident where Minjun offered Freak's companion what he thought was a universal gesture of hospitality, sharing food, and the companion, whose name translated roughly as one who accounts for distances, reacted with a full-body shudder and a high-pitched tone that sent Minjun backing into a shelf. It turned out that in Vetheron culture, offering prepared food to someone before establishing formal kinship category was deeply uncomfortable, similar to, as Freak laboriously explained, strangers walking into your home and beginning to undress. Minjun apologized 6 times. Freck translated the apologies with what sounded like suppressed laughter in the lower harmonic. There was also the incident where Jisoo, in her enthusiasm, touched the hull of the Vetheron shuttle to examine a surface detail and triggered a proximity alarm so loud that half the station came running. She was fine. The shuttle was fine. Jisoo's pride was not fine for about half a day, but she recovered. And there was the smaller, quieter incident, the kind that doesn't announce itself as significant until later, where Soo-yeon was reviewing translated data in the common room at 2200, alone, and Freck came in without his companions, which was unusual. The Vetheron moved in threesomes for practical reasons she'd understood, but hadn't yet absorbed emotionally. She looked up. Can't sleep? She asked, which was a stupid question, because she didn't know if Vetheran slept, and the translation unit had to process the idiom for 3 whole seconds. His ridges moved in a small, uncertain pattern. My companions cycle and rest, he said. I find this station's acoustic environment complex. There are sounds I am still mapping. She understood that. Youngto made a lot of sounds at night. The geothermal lines contracted in the cold. The greenhouse humidifiers ran on a cycle. The dust moved against the outer hull in a soft, constant whisper she'd heard her whole life. It's the copper dust, she told him. Against the walls. You get used to it. He tilted his head. The motion was very slightly not human, a degree or two wider than she expected, but the quality of it, uncertain, attentive, was familiar enough that her chest did something she didn't examine immediately. Do you? He asked. Still hear it? Every night, she admitted. I just stopped minding. He sat down across the table from her, not close, but not at the far end either, and looked at the data on her screen without asking what it was. She didn't explain. They sat for a while in the company of the dust sounds and the humidifier cycle, and she thought, this is very strange. And also, it is not strange at all. On the 4th day, things got complicated. Freek's ship, the Vethal Soren, which translated as something like patient wanderer, had not come to this sector by coincidence. They were part of an exploration wing, cataloging unclaimed deep space bodies. The Vetheran had been doing this for 200 years by their calendar. What Freek had not yet explained, because it required careful translation and careful politics, was that another entity also cataloged this sector. A collective called the Grethta, who were not aggressive exactly, but who had very firm ideas about resource rights, and who did not acknowledge the colonial claims of species they had not formally encountered. In plain terms, Jungto Station was on a moon that the Grethta considered surveyed territory, and a Grethta assessment vessel would arrive in approximately 18 days. Suyan received this information without moving her face very much, which was a skill she'd learned from her mother. She waited until Freek had finished, watched his ridges flatten in what she now knew meant concern, and then said, How serious? The Grethta do not make war easily, Freek said carefully. But they dispute, through formal process, through declaration, and they do not recognize the colonial right of, he searched for a word, new contact species without sponsor. And you, Minjun said from across the table, with the bluntness he never bothered suppressing, could be that sponsor. Freek's ridges did the uncertain ripple. It is not my authority alone to offer. I would need to transmit a proposal to my command, and there are, another pause, conditions to the sponsor relationship that are not simple. What conditions? Suyan asked. He looked at her directly, that amber-eyed, wide lateral gaze that she'd stopped finding unsettling days ago. His ridges were very still, which she'd learned meant he was choosing words with more care than usual. It requires the sponsoring vessel's designation to be formally linked to the colony. The Vethal Soren would carry Jungto's name in its registration, and I would be accountable for this colony's conduct and standing in Vetheran formal record. Minjun said, That sounds like marriage. Freck's translation unit made a sound that wasn't in its standard output range, something very short and involuntary. It is, Freck said. A category of formal bond with some resemblances, yes. The room went quiet enough that the dust on the outer hull was very clearly audible. Suyan said, slowly, That's your personal name registration, not just a formal agreement? Yes. She looked at the table. She looked at the data on her screen. She thought about her grandmother's beacon and the 11 years of silence and the power cells she'd been swapping out her whole life on the chance that someone would answer. She thought about the sound this man made in the acoustics of her common room at night, present and careful and curious. She thought about 18 days. She said, I need to think about this. Yes, Freek said, and his ridges made the ripple that Hana called his smile. I expected that. She didn't sleep well, not because of the dust sounds, which she never minded, but because the thing she was thinking about wasn't whether to accept the formal arrangement. She could see the logic, even the necessity, but whether the logic was the only reason she'd be accepting it. That was a more complicated question.
She was 33 years old and had run a deep space colony station for 2 years and had never had the luxury of making decisions that were also personal, because every decision here was collective, weighted by the 112 other people whose lives it shaped. She talked to Hana, who listened and said, "You've been going to the common room at night." Sooyeon said, "I work late." Hana said, "You also work early. You're going at the time he's awake." Sooyeon didn't answer that. She talked to old Chul, who ate another piece of dried plum candy and said, "My grandfather was born here without asking to be. We were all born into this place without asking. The question was never whether this station was worth staying for. It always was. The question is whether you want to stay in it alone or not." He offered her a piece of candy. It was the first time he'd done that. On the 7th day, she found Freak at the signal tower, not climbing it, just standing at its base, looking up the length of it in the thin morning light. The red dust shifted around his boots the same way it shifted around hers. He hadn't suited up fully. He wore his own thermal layer, which handled the cold better than she'd expected, and he had his translation unit on his wrist but wasn't using it at the moment, just standing there with his ridges quiet, reading the tower. "My grandmother welded the first section of that herself," Sooyeon said, coming up beside him. "She had 4 people helping her and not enough proper equipment, and she did it anyway. Said the point was just to make a sound and send it outward. Let the universe know we were here." Freak didn't answer immediately. His ridges moved slowly, thinking. Then, "The Vetheron have a concept. Vethalore. It means," he considered, "the thing you transmit before you know if anyone is listening. Not a message." An existence. He paused.
"Your beacon is Vethalore." She looked at the tower. The copper light on it was red-orange in the early hours, the sun coming up over the moon's near ridge at a flat angle that made everything glow. She said, "When you heard it, what did you think?" He looked at her. That careful, wide, amber look. "I thought it was..." And here the translation unit had a complicated second. "The bravest thing I had received in a long time. To simply say, 'I am here,' with no guarantee of answer." Her chest did the thing again. She let herself feel it this time. "If we formalize the sponsorship," she said, "it's your name on our registry. Your formal bond. That's not nothing for you." "No," he agreed. "Do you want to?" she asked. Directly, because she was her mother's daughter and her grandmother's granddaughter, and she had not survived this far in deep space by being imprecise about things that mattered. Not as policy, not as strategy. "Do you want to?" His ridges went through something she hadn't quite seen before. Not the smile ripple, not the concern flatten, something slower and more complicated. He turned to face her fully. "I have been a deep-range explorer for 14 years, he said. "I have cataloged 43 systems. I have never found anything that..." And the translation unit produced a harmonic alongside the words, something in the lower register, something warm and off-kilter and unguarded. "That was already expecting me." The wind pushed the dust sideways between them. She could smell the copper of it. She said, "We'll need a formal ceremony for the colony's benefit. They'll have questions." "Of course." "Minjun will have a lot of questions." "I have noticed this about Minjun, yes." She almost laughed. She did, actually, quietly, into the cold air, and she saw his ridges do the thing that was his laugh, the quick asymmetric flutter, and that was somehow the most natural moment she'd had in a long time. The council meeting was detailed and long, and Jisoo drew 17 diagrams of the legal implications, and Minjun asked 22 questions that were mostly the same question reworded, and Chol ate all of his candy and then fell asleep briefly, and nobody commented on it. By the end, the colony voted. 109 yes, 3 abstentions, no objections. The formal registration was transmitted to the Vethal Soren's command on day 9. It came back approved on day 12, with the secondary note that no veteran explorer had filed a colonial bond registration in 61 years, and that the command was, in the lower harmonic that Hana read aloud with great relish, deeply curious. The Grethta assessment vessel arrived on day 17, a day early, which was rude in both species' customs as far as anyone could tell. It was large and angular and transmitted its presence with the bureaucratic confidence of an entity that had never been told no. Freak handled the formal contact from Jungto's communication center, standing at the equipment console with his ridges flat and professional, and Soo-yeon stood at his side because this was her station and she would stand where she chose. The exchange was long and formally structured and required 3 rounds of document confirmation, and then it was over. The Gretheda vessel acknowledged the registration. It logged its survey notation as previously inhabited, sponsor bonded, non-accessible, and it left. Minjun, watching the departure on the sensor feed, said, "That's it?" "That's it," Freak said. Minjun looked profoundly unsatisfied. "I prepared arguments." "You can save them," Soo-yeon told him. "There will be others." And there would be. She knew that the way she knew the sound of the dust, the weight of the power cells, the particular cold of Kepler 442b's pre-dawn air. This was not the end of a problem. It was the beginning of being known. But that evening, after the council dispersed and the station settled into its night sounds, thermal lines, humidifier cycle, dust, she was in the common room with the data screen off for once, and Freak came in from the direction of the docking bay and sat across from her with a second cup of the Vetheren equivalent of tea, which smelled like pine resin and tasted, she'd discovered, like something between cardamom and regret. He pushed it toward her. She picked it up. They sat in the ordinary, copper-scented quiet of Jungto Station, and outside the signal tower blinked its patient light into the dark, and from somewhere above them, the Vethal Soren held its orbit with the easy permanence of something that had decided to stay. She did not know exactly what came next. She'd never known what came next. That had never stopped her before. She drank the tea. It tasted a little less like regret than it had the first time.